Hello, this is Samuel Coper from Fort Observer, and welcome to part 3 of breaking down Civil War II. If you haven't seen part 1, then I recommend that you start there because I am picking my way through all these implications. And then at the end of this series, I think we'll really have a much better idea of what we can expect for the future. Now, speaking of the future, none of what I say is a prediction. I don't make predictions. Intelligence people do not make predictions. We're dealing with a very complex scenario that's potentially far away in the future. There are an incalculable number of variables. There could be white swans, there could be black swans. Who knows what's going to happen in the future that could knock this off course. But we can reduce uncertainty about the future. We can begin looking at things and saying, this is more likely to happen and this is less likely to happen. And then we can start making some strategic decisions based off what's more likely and what's less likely to happen. Now, I got several comments from the last video asking, well, where should I go and what should I do to be preparing for this? Now, I can't answer those questions for you, but I will provide you with my thought process as if I were answering those questions for myself. And I will do that in a future video. All right, let's recap part 2 real quick. I looked into how the United States might balkanize. I didn't go into great detail, but I provided some factors to consider. And then I always want to consider the alternative of any scenario. One mistake that a lot of people make is we focus on one scenario without considering the alternative. So I looked at a few different alternatives to civil war or revolution in the last video. And then in part 3, we're going to talk about the fate of empires, the difference between hard power and soft power and why that matters. And then we're going to look at one of a couple of rubrics. It's called Elements of National Power. In terms of stacking up sides, investigating who might win a conflict, we have to look at elements of national power. That moves beyond just this military question here, because there are a lot of factors that matter in conflict. It's not just force, and I will make that case convincingly. Now, we have to talk about the fate of empires because we're not just looking at a potential political or ideological balkanization or secession or whatever it might become. This low-intensity conflict, one accelerator, it probably is this concept of the fate of empires. This is a great book. It's only like 20 or 30 pages long. It's written by Sir John Glubb, a British guy, and he served during the First World War in France, and then later during World War II, he commanded the Jordan Arab Legion, and he fought against pro-Nazi Germany and Vichy regimes in Iraq and Syria. Now, he originally published The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival in 1978, and The Fate of Empires should be required reading for every American. I will put a link in the video so where you can download and read that, but I will give you the Cliff's Notes versions or the Sam's Notes versions right now. Sir John Glubb in this book points out that the only thing we learn from history is that men never learn from history. And he explains why, in part by saying that the history we learn is actually little more than propaganda. And we forego the teaching or forego the learning about the periods of failure and disgrace. And that, he says, leads us to not learn the lessons that we should, and it's why we commit the same mistakes again and again. If there's one lesson in particular that we Americans should learn about history, then it's about the fate of empires. There have been many empires, and they don't begin or end on an exact date, but they all share one thing in common. From the Assyrian Empire, which lasted roughly 247 years, to the Roman Republic, which lasted about 233 years, the Ottoman Empire, which lasted 250 years, the British Empire, which also lasted 250 years, and lots of others in that ballpark. The lesson learned here is that empires have expiration dates, and the average lifespan of empires is about 250 years from birth to collapse. That's about 10 generations. Glubb points out that the Assyrians fought with bows and spears, and the British fought with ships and artillery, but the lifespan of both of these empires was about the same. Now, empires have an outburst period from which they break out rapidly, often due to some characteristic of a unique idea or particularly strong culture. From that outburst period, there is this quote-unquote daring initiative that manifests itself into exploration and pioneering and ultimately expansion of this empire. Exploration and settlement turn into commercial expansion, and that creates wealth for this burgeoning empire. And it runs parallel to an age of conquest. The merchant sees the accumulation of wealth as a driving force. The military leaders and soldiers see glory and honor in conquest and expansion, and the two seem to reinforce each other. Now, this leads to the age of affluence, where culture becomes less courageous and less pioneering. Their initial exuberance is diminished. Their society becomes comfortable. Glubb writes of this age, quote, "Education undergoes the same gradual transformation. No longer do schools aim at producing brave patriots ready to serve their country." Now, this leads to what Glubb calls high noon. He writes, quote, "Enough of the ancient virtues of courage, energy, and patriotism survive to enable the state successfully to defend its frontiers. But beneath the surface, greed for money is gradually replacing duty and public service." End quote. He continues, quote, "The nation, immensely rich, is no longer interested in glory or duty, but is only anxious to retain its wealth and luxury. It's a period of defensiveness, from the Great Wall of China to Hadrian's Wall on the Scottish border to the Maginot Line in France in 1939. End quote. Once an empire has progressed through the age of pioneers, the age of conquests, and the age of affluence, it enters into the age of intellect. And Glubb writes, quote, "Every period of decline is characterized by this expansion of intellectual activity." That reminds me of something here. Glubb continues writing, quote, "The full flowering of the Arab and Persian intellectualism did not occur until after the imperial and political collapse. Thereafter, the intellectuals attained fresh triumphs in the academic field, but politically, they became the abject servants of often illiterate rulers." The bottom line is that the fate of empires is collapse. Glubb describes the inadequacy of this age of intellect. He says there's a loss of strength, of internal strength, which sparks civil dissensions. Quote, "Another remarkable and unexpected symptom of national decline is the intensification of internal political hatreds." And he says, instead of dropping this political hatred against each other and standing shoulder to save their empire in decline, the empire threatens itself. Now, another problem for empires in decline, Glubb writes, quote, "One of the oft-repeated phenomena of great empires is the influx of foreigners to the capital city. Roman historians often complain of the number of Asians and Africans in Rome. Glubb cites several empires that in their later stages welcomed very diverse groups of immigrants with open arms. And a survey of history shows that while this nation is affluent, all of these diverse groups appear equally loyal. After all, they're all enjoying the nation's wealth." But Glubb writes, quote, "But in an acute emergency, the immigrants will often be less willing to sacrifice their lives and their property than will be the original descendants." End quote. The Roman Empire created new citizens in order to expand the tax base. At the same time, it was devaluing its currency to meet its obligations. This is classic late-stage behavior, and it also does not seem too foreign of a concept here in the United States. Throughout human history, this last and final stage of empires in decline is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, and frivolity, the welfare state, and the weakening of religion. Now, we can look at the fate of empires through this American lens. The question is, when was our age of outburst? Did the American Empire begin in the 1770s with the American Revolution? Did it begin in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase and this concept of westward expansion, later manifest destiny, empire expansion? Or did it begin in 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine that focused on the expansion of influence in the Southern Hemisphere? So really the question is, when was the actual birth, not necessarily of the American nation, but when was the birth of the American Empire? And we can do some simple math. Keep in mind this 250-year period is just an average. Empires could live longer, they could die sooner. But one thing is for sure, every empire has an expiration date. Now, we could be looking at anywhere from the early 2020s to the early 2070s, according to this theory. And with this in mind, let's get back to understanding what the future could bring us, starting specifically with understanding how we begin examining a conflict. Now, there is this concept of hard power and soft power. And hard power is tanks, jets, bombers, troops, it's military strength, it's coercion by force. And then there's also soft power, which includes moral authority. Who is the aggressor? Who is the defender? That can make a big difference in conflict. We're looking at credibility and reputation. We're looking at ability to influence, and that's economic and financial influence. That's cultural influence, diplomatic influence. One of the reasons why the United States emerged from World War II with growing global power is that we had soft power. We had moral authority. We had credibility. We had increasing levels of economic and financial influence. We began exporting our culture abroad. In many cases, diplomatically, we were looked at the leader of the free world. That continued all throughout the Cold War. And if this fate of empires theory is true, which I think it is, then we can expect to see a decline in American hard power and a decline in American soft power as well. I think we can see that in the news. And that is not a recent thing. That's been happening for decades. And that does not bode well for the United States of America. Now, turning our attention to why hard power and soft power matters for us at the local or regional level, especially if you think that a region might balkanize, is because hard power and soft power is not an either or proposition. You are going to need both. And I understand that it's natural when we think about low intensity conflict, or we think about whatever kind of conflict that there might be, to think primarily about hard power, or maybe to think only about hard power. But keep this in mind. If you believe that Balkanization is likely, or that certain groups of Americans are going to have to secede in order to protect their culture and their way of life, in other words, avoid the imposition of socialism and tyranny, which I think we're headed for, then pay special attention to this, because you're going to need elements of soft power. We're talking about international recognition. We're talking about international trade and commerce, external support, just like the French involvement during the American Revolution. France recognized America as a sovereign country. The last thing that you want is to be an island of people that no one is willing to help. Now let's think about Vietnam. That war was lost at home. That war was lost because the communists and North Vietnamese applied soft power to foment unrest domestically here in the United States. And it didn't matter how much hard power the U.S. military had, the political will to continue was eventually degraded. Soft power is a critical enabler of hard power. How justifiable is this use of force? Can it be justified with moral authority, or with your credibility or your influence? Which side in a low-intensity conflict has more soft power? Soft power isn't everything, but it can help win conflicts. This is just something to think about, especially when we are looking at two sides of a conflict and trying to determine who's going to win. Now, let's also talk about the elements of national power. There are 8 of them, and I'm going to talk you through them. This is very much a high-level overview. I could probably do an entire video on each of these, but this should at least get you thinking about your state and which elements of national power does your state have, and where is your state vulnerable with regard to these elements of national power. Now, you may have heard the saying, terrain that favors the defender, which means that the physical terrain makes a location very difficult to invade. Now, domestically, I think a lot about West Virginia or the Northern Rockies as an area where the terrain favors the defender. But we could also be talking about an urban area like Grozny during the Chechen insurgency. The Russian military in the 90s, when this conflict was going on, would drive their tanks and armored personnel carriers through these city streets in Grozny, Chechnya. And they would get roadblocked, and then Chechen insurgents would fire down RPGs from the tops of these buildings, and they would hit the tanks, and the tanks were virtually helpless. And the Chechens destroyed dozens of Russian armored personnel carriers and tanks this way. In this case, the urban environment favored the defender, and that's something to keep in mind as well, because terrain matters. And it matters most for those who know how to use it, because terrain enables smaller forces to defeat larger forces in some cases. Now, there are other considerations for geography as well, like oceans. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are giant barriers to invasion of the United States. That's why everyone uses the Mexican border. Geography also matters. Now look at your state or your desired place of residence and consider its geographical strengths and limitations or vulnerabilities. For instance, the American Redoubt is part of the Rocky Mountain West. It's far away from Washington, D.C. It's mountainous. It's defensible except for its eastern margins, which is very much tank country. In some places, it's winter for 6 or 9 months out of the year. That makes it tougher to field a deployed army. It doesn't make it impossible. It just makes it more difficult. You're not invading the Bahamas. So think about your geographical strengths and limitations when considering how you might fare in this potentially coming conflict. Next is population. What are your state's population and demographic trends? There's a concept called the human terrain, and it's far more than race and ethnicity and gender. It's attitudes and beliefs of the people. It's the culture, history, outlook, and opinions, lots of other factors. And all these things are important to understand, especially with regard to soft power, because popular opinion matters. There's a concept in irregular warfare that includes guerrilla warfare. This concept called popular support. How do we get our neighbors to support us and oppose our adversary? As an intel guy, every person in my preparedness group is an intelligence collector. In the Army, we had the saying, every soldier is a censor. That means that every soldier had an obligation to maintain situational awareness, to look around, to collect information, pass up the information that was mission critical or maybe that had some sort of intelligence value. Well, in my group, every community member is a censor. Think about the life of the average Afghan. The Taliban would come into town and then leave when U.S. forces got there most of the time. Once the U.S. forces left, the Taliban would come back in. And the Taliban would buy or more likely steal from the markets or from these Afghan people. The average Afghan villager in these villages might learn some names or identify schedules of the Taliban movements or determine how large a force they had in the area. And all these things have intelligence value. And the more popular support we have means the more people we have to pass along valuable information. And that is a mission critical factor. Intelligence can be the deciding factor in victory or defeat. So I challenge you, begin with your neighbors and then begin looking at the statistics in your state and determine what are your strengths and weaknesses with regard to your state population. Natural resources is next, and that means money. It means jobs. It means that your world keeps spinning. Try living life without oil or coal-fired power plants. Not many people can. What is your area going to export, and what are you going to have to import if there is some type of economic or trade disruption? Are your lights going to stay on? Next is economic elements. What drives your local or state economy? Who are the major employers? How is your economy actually doing? Considering what I and many others believe is likely in the future, what are your state's economic vulnerabilities? How might they be exploited against you? How can your economy adapt to disruption during some of these events we've discussed? Now, for military, we can definitely include militias or paramilitary here, maybe the National Guard and regular components, which might feature heavily for your area as well. What type of units do you have? There's a big difference between a transportation company and an airborne infantry company. And there's a big difference between an infantry brigade and an armored tank brigade. How does your state stack up militarily to its peers, or how might the military stack up during some high-end conflict where the National Guard or regular component active duty troops might be involved? Another thing to think about is how might your state's military assets be used for you or with you or against you? And I would also include intelligence here. What is your state's intelligence gathering capability, and how does it compare to the national intelligence community? Intelligence matters a whole lot. Think about this. If Iraqis or Afghans had adopted social media as ubiquitously as Americans, those conflicts would have been over much sooner. I mean, we're talking probably months. Because as an intel guy, I've got all this data. I can see who's related to who's communicating with who's related to who might be in the same insurgent cells. It's a great indicator of someone's intelligence value. You know, one of the challenges that we had is we went and arrested some Taliban or Naqshbandi or Jaish al-Mahdi guy or whoever. And you can sit there and interrogate these people, or you can ask them questions. But until you actually learn who they are and where they fit into an overall organization, you really don't have a great sense of their intelligence value. Is this a low-level fighter, or is this a mid-level or national level commander? That would have been so much easier if Mohammed Abdullah had just been on Facebook. And frankly, I think that's a glaring and critical vulnerability of many Americans, because you're producing so much intelligence about yourself that could be exploited later. And look, I'm going to do an entire video dedicated to how I look at these military issues, because it's slightly more complex than just saying, well, the military voted for Trump. As is often the case, people who boil this issue down cleanly into like 2 or 3 sentences really suffer from not knowing what they don't know. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm going to explain this in a future video, but it's really not as simple as that. But let's move on. What does your state or region's political bodies look like? Do they or will they support Balkanization or secession in the future? What laws might they make during these challenging times? How difficult a challenge is it going to be to remake party or ideological politics in your state? Or how is your state being politically remade right now? These are all factors to consider. How prepared mentally or psychologically are you and your peers in your state to handle the challenges of these events? What is the national will of your state? I mean, if you were to view your state as a nation, what is your national will? How hard and for how long are you going to support this before you start to have second thoughts? Brexit is a really great example of how easy things are in theory versus how difficult they become in reality, because your opponents get a vote too. And finally, if you look up elements of national power, this last one is information. I have changed that because we have not yet looked at infrastructure. Now, there are 2 critical components of winning conflict, and they're rarely mentioned in these videos that I watch. The first is intelligence. We have to know what's going on. We have to make well-informed decisions. We have to know what to expect in the future so that we can adapt before it becomes too late. And the second is communications. We have to be able to relay messages. We have to be able to communicate directly or indirectly. Security is an important part of that. How can units communicate without risking exposure? Because if it emits a signal, it can be tracked. And I don't know about you, but I'm allergic to JDAMs. Past that, a unit cannot risk having its sensitive communications intercepted. This is one major reason why we were so effective tactically and operationally in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had good intelligence and we had good communications. The targeting cycle stayed fed. We were killing and capturing tons of insurgents and terrorists. And then for communications, we could communicate using our secure channels without fear that the Taliban was listening and setting up an ambush on our real-time location. That's certainly not going to be the case in future conflicts abroad, and that may not be the case domestically either. All right, now let's look at the difference between qualitative and quantitative. Lots of other videos talk about at what levels the people would support a revolution or some kind of conflict. You know, how is the state going to break down in terms of percentages of who's supporting what side? Lots of videos have opined on what military defections would look like in numbers, but they don't address qualitative issues. So a quantitative argument would say, I have 600 troops and you have 4,000 troops. Who would win? And the answer seems fairly obvious, right? But there are qualitative measurements to consider. My 600 troops are from the 1st Ranger Battalion and your 4,000 troops are from the 69th Soy Boy Division. And that's a slightly different fight now. I'll go back to things we should consider in military. There are line units, there are combat arms units. They actually go out and do the fighting. And then you have combat support and combat service support units. They typically are not fighting. They're typically on a FOB or on a big base somewhere, greasing the wheels of combat arms. So we can say that, oh, well, a third of the military is going to be on the side of whatever conflict. Well, until we break down that 30% and actually look at what units and what MOSs are involved in this 30%, we're not getting a clear picture, because you look at the breakdown of race and ethnicity in terms of combat arms, combat support, and combat service support, and there are differences. And I bring this up because many Democrats have argued that outside of whites, race is a good indicator of political affiliation. Now, it's not perfect, but on average, they say it's right. And if that's the case, then we have to look at the racial and, by extension, political differences among these military classes. A truck driver is not the same as an infantry guy, but I digress. And I will break all this down in a future video because it matters greatly. Now, it's Colonel Charlie Beckwith who said, quote, "I'd rather go down the river with 7 studs than with 100 shitheads." And if you know who that is, then you know that quality matters. A transportation company is not an infantry company. The only reason I harp on this is because there are different jobs, there are different MOSs in the military. And so we have to take that into consideration when we look at who would actually fight on either side. Now, this brings us to the end of part 3. In part 4, we're going to start to look at the doctrine of guerrilla warfare. I'm going to share some qualitative measurements. In other words, how can we grade the strength and capability of two sides in a conflict? We're going to look at phases of revolutionary conflict and try to gauge where we are right now. If this video was informative, please like it and subscribe. I'm recording this on the 4th of July, so happy Independence Day, everybody. Be safe over this weekend, and I'll be back next week. And until then, stay out front.